So for the final presentation for this evening, Professor Paul Ivey is Professor of Art History at the University of Arizona and will be taking us in another direction, but related in a very interesting way into the architecture of the Church of the New Jerusalem. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Aaron. It's really great being here. Yeah, this is a little different than the last talk, but it's interesting that it also is about nature. I mean, undoubtedly, the notion of the sacred that you guys are talking about is a really good model for that. Okay. A temple suitable for the new church should be such as will answer all her wants. Every useful part would have a spiritual correspondence to it. Thus, each architectural member, as well as the whole building, would necessarily represent the church, and being thus a recipient of her life, would be, as Swedenborg expresses it, alive. Emanuel Swedenborg's theory of correspondence allowed for the spiritual to be recognized in nature, expressed through church architecture, and articulated in idealized urban spaces, such as those inspired by Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful, culminating in his 1909 plan of Chicago. Today, I would like to explore some of the key ideas that emerged in church periodicals concerning new church architecture and relate these briefly to Burnham's plan. It is important to note, beyond theological intentions, that the building of an attractive church was recognized as bringing respectability to a new denomination often criticized by its Christian neighbors. As one English member stated upon the completion of the Newcastle Church in 1861, quote, "It is an edifice that is a real addition to the outward respectability of the new church. May it be the means of adding extensively to the true members of the church." To Swedenborg, the macrocosm and microcosm, though dissimilar in form, were analogous in interpretation. His important doctrine of correspondence between the worlds of spiritual and material reality became an important organizational semiotic template for the architects of new church congregations as they began to build their unique edifices for worship. From the middle of the 19th into the 21st century, Swedenborgians built churches that not only manifested the tenets of their faith, but were demonstrations of important correspondences that would magnify that faith. Moreover, Swedenborg's theory of correspondence encouraged the ideal of the spiritual to be recognized in nature. Swedenborg was even described by Ralph Waldo Emerson as standing most eminently for the translator of nature into thought. As one early church tract put it, quote, "This heavenly science of correspondence unfolds and explains the relations which exist between the spiritual and the natural world, showing how all things which exist in the natural world are effects from causes existing and operating in the spiritual world. These effects could be expressed through church architecture and are actuated or made alive, vivified by engaging us through analogically and symbolically charged correspondences, producing imaginative spiritual ideas of worship." The science of correspondence created an active way to perceive spiritual realities. Briefly, it explains that all things have at least three levels of meaning: the natural, derived from human observation, history, and science; the spiritual, emerging from the imagination and mind; and the divine, which reveals God. The idea that we can see beyond the mere material form to a spiritual idea, analogy, or symbol energized Swedenborgians to look to nature in order to see God. The idea of order itself also underpinned this interpretive practice through Swedenborg's doctrine of uses, implying a self-actualization in the building of the perfect society, as revealed in Swedenborg's revelation of three heavens, which I'll talk about. As one theologian put it, quote, "Man at his best is ever seeking the beauty of order in himself, in his family, and in government. He would not persist in this effort if he were not aware that in himself are the possibilities of a corresponding order." In organizing and building the new church, members were left with many of Swedenborg's descriptions that led them to consider correspondences in architecture. Some examples are stones signifying the truths of faith, that churches in the spiritual kingdom are built of stone and churches in the celestial kingdom are built of wood, which signifies good. Architect Cass Gilbert's shingle-style Virginia Street Church, erected in St. Paul in 1886, is an excellent example of these meditations on correspondences. The Fieldstone foundation, a unique feature of the church, symbolizes the endurance of, quote, God's divine truths upon which we as humans are to build our framework of belief and understanding. Was there an architectural style most appropriate for the new church? Many examples in the 19th century were neo-Gothic, such as Edmund Lynn's small Brandywine blue granite church in Wilmington, Delaware, completed in 1858, or the church in Philadelphia, an elaborate high-style Gothic design by Theo Chandler, built in 1881. By 1873, the New Church magazine defended Gothic architecture, quote, as a connecting link between the artistic taste of a past and present age. It has, above all things, the appearance of a natural and spontaneous growth, harmonizing with the aspect of the place and with the feelings of the people. But the magazine also defended the classical style. Quote, so with the wonderful products of Greek art and architecture, they are models of perfection for all time on their plane. So growth and nature were associated with the Gothic, order and perfection with the classical. The geometries of the classical style didn't so much mimic natural forms as they distilled them. So emerged a fundamental ambivalence to the question of style, with only a few congregations choosing classicism, such as the 1859 New York Church in Murray Hill, designed by James Hoe. The newspapers reported that it was planned as a Gothic church, but it opened as a Renaissance classical building with pilasters and pedimented windows. Besides defending the applicability of historical styles for the new church, questions emerged concerning the spatial and hierarchical arrangements of the church. As early as 1841, English artist Joseph Andrews claimed, quote, every great change in religious faith has manifested itself by a corresponding change in architecture. It is reasonable then to suppose that the new church must soon reshape architecture. He suggested that since man is governed by the law of correspondence, there should be three parts to every church building. The lower or basement to contain rooms for instruction on the natural level, the main floor corresponding to the spiritual degree as a place of worship, and the higher floors corresponding to the inmost in man, where the Lord's Supper is celebrated. This was prescient of debates to come. In terms of style, certainly the most superb example of Greek classicism in the early American church is in Bath, Maine, designed and built by Zena Hyde. The church in the slide is the rebuilt edifice after snow crushed the building in 1920. The original church was built in 1844 during the rise of fashionable Greek revival architecture and was inspired by Hyde's travels in Italy. He was particularly inspired by the Church of St. Francis of Paolo's facade in Naples, Italy. But classicism also manifested a divine order of perfection. Hyde wanted the new structure to, quote, be one of the most elegant buildings that adorn the banks of the broad and beautiful Kennebec River, and to correspond to the orderly nature of the divine as described by Swedenborg. God is order itself. But the Gothic style was believed to imitate the forms of nature. Therefore, it was an essentially beautiful style because of this closest to nature itself. Nature was also central to influential Romanticism. And Swedenborg had written that the ancients worshipped in groves because groves of trees signify heavenly wisdom and intelligence, reminding us of William Cullen Bryant's popular poem in which he stated that the groves were God's first temples. In 1792, Sir James Hall, using ash posts and supple willow poles, demonstrated his notion of the origins of Gothic architectural forms from trees. Out of the Gothic, American arts and crafts was embraced for its more direct application of natural forms. Arts and crafts inherited the ideals of Goethe and Ruskin, particularly the notion that art and architecture related directly to nature and morals, producing spiritual uplift. Here, correspondence is not just a casual or functional relation, but as Swedenborgs would call it, a mode of influx. This is demonstrated in the most unique church in the movement, the Swedenborgian Church of San Francisco, completed in 1895. This edifice was built for a new society of the church in San Francisco. The first society had built a temple in 1865. On the left, note the boardwalks keeping sand at bay, and then a second edifice on the right in 1890. The first society had 143 members at the time of the building of the new Lion Street Church, as it was called, which had 49 members on its rolls. The chapel and garden, planned by Minister Joseph Worcester, together with architect Albert Schweinfurth, A. Page Brown, Bernard Maybeck, and with artistic contributions by Bruce Porter and William Keith, there's some beautiful murals in the church itself, was designed as an arts and crafts collaboration. Schweinfurth and Maybeck would go on to build other important arts and crafts churches in the Bay Area, including Schweinfurth's first Unitarian church in Berkeley from 1898, and Maybeck's brilliant First Church of Christ Zionist of 1910, also in Berkeley. In Maybeck's church, original materials were simple and selected with originality, poured concrete, fir and redwood, medieval-looking glass placed in factory sashes, painted stenciled decorations, all exposed. To some, the rough-hewn, there's the church, sorry, I think that slide got a little lost there. To some, the rough-hewn wood beams in the building and its setting evoked a Japanese garden shrine, not at all dissimilar from the new San Francisco Swedenborgian church. Its compound is entered through a gated portico, which moves one into the planned Japanese-style garden, featuring trees from all over the world, meant to indicate the inner penetrations of spirit and nature, of the seen and the unseen. Worcester, the minister, was, among many other things, a great lover of nature, friend of John Muir, and nature was most clearly a revelation of the divine mind. In the garden, correspondences abound and were outlined in 1940 by the Reverend Othmar Tobish. The redwood, for example, means unity of mankind, and the cedar signifies a spiritual, rational mind. Helen Purdy's 1912 guidebook to San Francisco summed up her thoughts about the relationship of the architecture of the chapel to its natural surroundings, where the noises of the city are shut out. Quote, "First, in the hearts of those who love San Francisco for her unique artistic spots is the little Swedenborgian church. But it is to something deeper than the artistic sense that the quiet loveliness of this church appeals, an island of simple beauty in a sea of artificiality. It sheds its benign influence over all who enter its gates. No one of whatever creed or denomination can leave that spot unblessed. No troubled spirit can fail to be soothed by its sweet serenity." Sounds a lot like the last talk. The inspiration for the chapel itself, what one writer called an ideal village church, was Spanish mission architecture based on an Italian church in the Po Valley near Verona, with reference to the Franciscans who had brought Mediterranean architecture to California. The exterior is brick with a small tower on the southern side wall, crowned by a wrought iron Franciscan cross with two bells on either side of a column of Carrara marble. The interior is completely natural arts and crafts, with a large fireplace offset in the nave and beautiful wood tones of Oregon pine. As an early visitor put it, quote, "Before one is seated, there is a consciousness of a friendly feeling extended by the warmth that comes from a generous supply of pine knots blazing upon an ample hearth that make one feel that the forest is near." The distinctive wood beams are local madrone with bark intact, a Gothic and California touch. The congregation worships in an old growth forest, seated on 80 hand-woven rush-bottomed seats. An early visitor noted, "It tranquilized and satisfied as nature in the deep woods satisfied." A screen of natural wood fronts the room. Above is a branch of native oak. Historian Kevin Starr called it an incipiently utopian memorialization of religion and nature made whole through art. A San Francisco Chronicle article concluded that the church was, quote, "low-toned, still, comforting, quiet as the peace of God. Everything with all its beauty is so quiet that even the beauty does not obtrude, expressing the doctrines of Swedenborg interpreted by his modern disciples, revolt against materialism, correspondence between nature and revelation. Another newspaper reported that the building is itself a lesson. It teaches truth and honesty, and called it a sermon in church building. Between the years 1915 and 1921, during the building of the Grand Brynathan Cathedral, there was much talk in Swedenborgian circles about church architecture. Reverend Frank Sewell, minister of the Washington, D.C. church from 1899, settled just after it had been destroyed by fire, contributed to the debates concerning appropriate styles and symbolism of certain church plans. Chicago minister L. Eric Wethy joined in and elaborated a plan for a church design that would correspond more exactly to the ancient Jewish tabernacle in a search for divine origins and continuities as correspondences. Sewell was well placed to contribute to the architecture of the young denomination. He had grown up in the Bath Church. He had been pastor of both the Urbana, Ohio and the Glasgow, Scotland societies while their new churches were being built, and was now poised to help build the national church. When in Glasgow for 3 years, he persuaded the congregation to build a new edifice in the early English Gothic style. In 1899, Sewell wrote to the Washington, D.C. church believing they should build anew after the fire, and recommended that whatever was built should be distinguished at first glance by its elegance, its beauty, its perfect adaptation to its sacred and high use as an external representation and habitation of the Lord's new church. Sewell proposed H. Langford Warren for the job as architect, probably based on the success of his English Gothic Swedenborgian chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts from 1901, with its 75-foot-long nave, noble archway, and raised chancel, containing the altar and the elaborate repository of the Word. This church later inspired the 1929 Pittsburgh church by Brynathan architect Harold Thorpe Carswell. When I visited, a member referred to it as their mini cathedral. Sewell undoubtedly gave Warren many ideas relating to the kind of church to build, but only in 1915 do we understand what those ideas were. Sewell hoped that they would be helpful to the readers of the New Church Messenger in the erection of churches in the future. Many of the features of this new ideal church had already been realized in the Washington, D.C. edifice, described in 1908 as, quote, Gothic architecture, built of stone, extremely chaste and simple in general effect, while solid and true, without high color and interior finish, and with a deep chancel and altar of stone as repository for the word. Sewell described it more theologically, quote, the baptismal font is in the front of the sanctuary at the secular level, while the altar is located several steps above in the sacred realm. More generally, he asked if there could be a distinctively new church temple that avoided the danger of a crude tampering with good architecture under the plea of representing the correspondences. He suggested, after Swedenborg's description of a double temple in his book, True Christian Religion, that a hierarchical approach to the two sacraments of baptism and the Holy Supper would be best served through a spatial separation or progress leading through 3 levels. From the natural, the nave for baptism and instruction, the spiritual for preaching, praying, and singing, up to the celestial or the upper room for the altar. From the pavement without, Sewell wrote, a vista may be seen through the entire building, leading up to the word reposing in light upon the altar in the upper room. He suggested the Byzantine basilicas model with the rectangular nave giving way to a semicircular dome chancel. As examples, he cited San Miniato in Florence and Westminster Cathedral in London. The rather dramatic 4-foot separation between these zones and the 30-foot wide staircase up to the upper room in Sewell's chancel plan was reduced in Warren's church to 3 steps or platforms of access to the altar, representative of 3 states of man's regeneration, the natural, spiritual, and celestial. Sewell noted that the Byzantine style he desired was abandoned by the architect for the Gothic, but still it was a very beautiful example of this favorite ecclesiastical style. In 1916, Chicago minister L. Eric Wethy more fully elaborated what he saw as Sewell's contribution with correspondences to the ancient Jewish tabernacle. Let us suppose we have a church building with 3 divisions, he wrote, divided into an entrance outer court, an inner part equivalent to the customary nave or holy place, and an innermost part forming the Holy of Holies. It would be possible to behold the Word shining in its innermost recess, corresponding to the Ark of the Covenant. People could not but be struck by the similarity of such a church to the Jewish tabernacle and would perceive the Christian interpretation of that tabernacle as it applies to the 2 sacraments which have taken place of the peculiar Jewish forms. He suggested putting the baptismal font in the entrance court like the Anglicans did. Earlier at Urbana, Sewell inspired the congregation to build a new church in 1880 and drew the plans. Its details of architecture have a meaning, the New Church Messenger reported. As you look at it, you see God's word set up on its high altar, its 3 main divisions. First, the altar, the place of the word. Second, its lectern and pulpit, its place of instruction. And this, its pews and choir stalls, that is, its place for its worshipers, representing, for one thing, any human life. We need to be instructed first in the things of this world, then in the things of heaven. 3 great planes of human life are represented here in this church. The Episcopal seat of the General Church also built these ideas into its plan. The church was initially designed by famous Gothicist Ralph Adams Cram, who had designed the English perpendicular style Church of the Open Word in Newtonville, Massachusetts in 1893. Raymond Pitcairn, who wanted to create an organic structure built through communal effort, supervised the church building. The chancel is divided into 3 receding sections, each rising from 3 steps. A guide states that the major divisions of the cathedral are symbolic of the degrees of life in man. The inmost mind is represented by the sanctuary, the internal mind by the chancel, and the external mind by the nave. The Gothic style was also applauded as a fulfillment of a new Christianity. Its organic functionalism enabled the builders of the Brynathan Cathedral to use an old form while adopting it to a new belief. In 1921, Brynathan architect D. Donald Robe wrote, "From an artistic point of view, the doctrine of correspondence is the most precious possession of the new church. It is not difficult to imagine a school of ecclesiastical architecture superior to that of the Middle Ages. A modest beginning has been made in several of our churches, notably at Brynathan. It is not too much to expect that the new Christianity, once fully established in the world, will clothe itself with a new architecture, grafted on the Gothic of the old Christianity, and that this style will give full and free expression to the new doctrines and be a thing more beautiful than the world has ever seen." An Australian churchman disagreed outrightly and thought that the Brynathan church was anticlimax. Is the Gothic scheme of architecture, its nave, chancel, and rows of pillars, the best adapted for teaching and hearing? Some of us perhaps would have preferred a building that should more nearly accede to that divine ideal. Behold, I make all things new. By mid-century, congregations and architects began to produce new visions of the relationship between nature and spirituality. With the Wayfarers Chapel in Rancho, Palos, Verdes, California, we discover a church completely new in its vision and interpretation. Lloyd Wright's chapel was completed and dedicated in 1951 as a memorial to Emanuel Swedenborg. At first a glass church, now it is a tree chapel. Transparent glass brings the majestic redwoods into close proximity. Geometries in the church are correspondences. For instance, round windows, quote, remind us of the oneness of God, the ongoing of life, and our striving towards wholeness. The trees surrounding us represent our lives as we strive to live and grow Godward. As the church issued brochure assures us, The harmony of glass, wood, and stone, combined with the beauty of natural surroundings, symbolizes the integral relationship of our inner world of mind and spirit with God's universe. Interestingly, the tree church might remind us of a description by Swedenborg from his 1758 treatise, Other Planets. On one of the planets that he visited, spirits showed him sacred gathering places made from trees that have not been cut down, but are still growing in their native soil. They plant these in patterns right from the beginning to become covered walkways. And while their branches are still pliable, well in advance, they trim and prune them so that as they grow, they will intertwine and join together to form floors, walls, and eventually arches overhead to form a roof. This immediately made me think of the beautiful madrone pine beams in the San Francisco church. And Pastor Alan Cowley told me about Patrick Doherty's work. And though not living, these are very suggestive in this context. The Wayfarers Chapel actually became something of a new church form. It was a featured centerpiece at the 1964 World's Fair in New York and inspired other churches, such as this quite beautiful 1958 Church of the Open Word Garden Chapel in St. Louis, designed by Leslie Black and Erwin Schmidt. More contemporary examples followed that integrated nature into worship. The new Church of Boulder Valley, Lafayette, Colorado, for example, completed by Davis Partnership Architects in 2002. Following the Boulder Valley congregation's desire to reveal correspondences between nature and spiritual forces, the firm juxtaposed light, water, rock, and trees to hold a specific meaning. All of nature is a theater to find the divine. The altar itself is a large, rough boulder, punctuated by candles and holding the word. Water is captured from the roof into a cistern outside, aligned to the altar inside. This is indicative of the connection between rock and water, when Moses, at God's command, smote a rock from which flowed water, sustenance for both his followers and their livestock while they were in the wilderness. The rock is the immovable, unchangeable word, the flowing water, its life-giving capacity. Other contemporary churches have also used large boulders as altars, such as the Westville, South Africa church built in 1970 and the Oak Arbor Church in Rochester, Michigan, built in 2002. Here in Tucson, the 1987 Sunrise Chapel also has a rock altar. Pastor Nathan Gladish told me that the focal point of the chapel is a work of God's creation, an uncut stone with a very special copy of the Word of God resting on it, symbolic of the words in Psalms, "The Lord is my rock," and from 2 Samuel, "And who is a rock save our God?" Another symbolic boulder rests in the church at Boynton Beach, Florida, built in 1989, whose founding pastor, doing some work with the Kitchener, Ontario church, was there when a large boulder was unearthed many years ago. He asked the congregation to save it for him because someday he would use it as a sacred altar, a dream realized some 2 decades later when he used a pickup truck to take it from Canada to Boynton Beach. Now, this is not simply a romanticized spiritualization. Correspondences between nature and spirituality put the human worshiper back into a sacred relationship with our nature within nature, and encourages us to consider the complex relationships we have with our natural and built environments beyond the merely physical, in order to encounter and grasp our profound mutual connections and reliance. Within the broader area of urban planning, the symbolic correspondences within individual churches found articulation in larger geometric structures in visionary Swedenborgian architect Daniel Burnham's plans. He believed in the reformative power of pure, rational architectural form. City Beautiful was Burnham's urban renewal movement based on the success of his designs for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago as a model for the civilized city. It promoted urban spaces defined by wide boulevards, lined with grand classical buildings, flanked by gardens and open spaces. This created a unity of the public cityscape And in this scheme, churches and other governmental and social organizations would raise the moral and aesthetic standards of urban dwellers and contribute visually to the city as a whole. As historian Irving D. Fisher argues, quote, Burnham devised a plan for Chicago whose contours he deliberately based upon the heavenly city described in Swedenborg's book, Heaven and Hell. He believes that the doctrine of correspondence figures prominently in Burnham's plan through three distinct circuits that correspond to Swedenborg's three heavens. Swedenborg revealed the divine structure of heaven to be concentrically organized around a radiant center. In Burnham's scheme, the outermost circle corresponds to the first heaven, outside major centers of government and culture as the natural heaven. The inner city corresponds to the spiritual or middle heaven and contains a threefold grouping of monumental buildings devoted to literature, science, and art, as well as other intellectual institutions sited in well-organized parks. The center plan corresponds to the celestial heaven, and as the heart of Chicago is given over to financial, corporate, and governmental functions, manifestations of authority, permanence, and legitimacy. It is from this civic center that the series of radial arterials diverge, from which functionality, benevolence, and order radiate throughout the city. Concluding, the interest in these tripartite groupings, based on Swedenborg's heaven, the 3 degrees of life, and the word, seem to ultimately correspond. The larger cityscape and its potential to articulate the heavenly city, and the church as the real and symbolic microcosm of advancing, regenerating spirituality based in nature. Thank you.